So we have about 30 minutes for discussion. Let's have some questions, and we'll take them 3 or 4 at a time, and then the panelists can respond.
Excuse me, can we let Alexander standing up there so easier?
Oh, okay, why don't you come in? Yeah. Oh, yes, because we've been filmed, right? Is that good?
You can't escape.
No, no. Believe you. Okay, so who would like to? Yes, please. Could you give your name and institution before you speak? Yes.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks. Hi, I'm Dan Gilligan from Fifth Street. Really nice presentation. I really appreciate each one of them. My question now is for Sam. I thought that was really clear, Sam, and very helpful on kind of the potential for anticipatory social protection in Mozambique. I wonder, you laid out clearly that the system was essentially overwhelmed in delivering transfers. Is it the case that sort of the layering of, should I drop this? I'm just going to shout and out of that.
Yeah, this mic, is this one off? Okay. There could be some interference. Oh, yeah.
Try again with the mic.
I think that's fixed. Is it better? No. Okay. I'm going to just yell. Bye, Sam.
I got the first bit, thank you.
Yeah, so I'm wondering whether actually adding the anticipatory components, so the need to actually do the forecasting and then apply that across those areas, I wasn't 100% clear if that was actually kind of compounding the delivery effects, or essentially that was just, so it was an added component and an additional burden, but I'm not sure they would have gotten much farther without it. So that's my main question. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Yeah, hi, I'm Rachel Sabatis-Wheeler from the Institute of Development Studies. Thank you for those presentations. I have 2 questions, one for Saludin. Thank you. I'm just wondering, in terms of your results, it's quite clear that the effects are very different across the south and the north, and with different tailing off. And I'm wondering, in terms of your conclusion, you didn't quite, as far as I was concerned, you didn't quite take it far enough in terms of what are the implications then for how we do programming, particularly around cash plus, P plus programs. So are you saying that context is that important, that we should be tailoring our plus components to different contexts? Because that's what we're seeing in other literature, some from IDS as well, that particularly in a shock context of conflict, for example, maybe our plus components should not be on providing seeds and fertilizer, should be on more peace, social inclusion activities. So I'm just wondering where that takes us. Can you push your conclusions to more implications? That would be helpful for programs. And then for Sam, so really interesting. I think what you're finding is very, we find that across the board in so many programs, right? We find that the real value of cash gets eroded. We can't keep it up to date. We find also that, capacity gaps, the premature load bearing, all of that, we see it in so many programs. So again, I'm thinking, where does that take us? You've taken us so far. We all actually, it's intuitive, that is right, we agree. But what does it mean? Does it mean we should do, is it specific to the fact that you're talking about elderly? You were talking about transfers to the elderly, I think. Is that why a lot of people have died off in the, you know what I mean?
Yep.
So I'm thinking, is that quite specific to the program? And if it's not, are you suggesting we do sort of more targeted geographic targeting to make better use of our finances? What are we supposed to do with this information? I'm struggling with how do we work with that.
Good, thank you. Yes, yes, okay, so we'll have one on this side and one on this side, and then we'll go to the panel. Yeah. Please, you, and then the gentleman there, and then we'll yeah.
Yes, hi, I'm Richard.
Speak up a little bit.
I'm Richard from UNICEF Innocenti. I had a quick question for Saludin on the Bangladesh study. So I was wondering, you showed us that the impacts over the long term faded away, and I was wondering if you have an idea whether it was that the treatment groups were actually getting worse after the treatment stopped, or is it the control group that is picking up to the same level as the treatment group was being at because of maybe economic growth or some other things that happened to the control group in general that brought them up to the same level as the treatment group. So do you have any information on that? I was interested to see. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Ivan, I'm from FAO. I was particularly interested about all the discussions of course, but like we're doing work on cash plus components in the Office of Evaluation. But it's interesting to see that this is cash plus and it's cash plus food. What we usually do is like cash plus some sort of agricultural intervention, either on livestock, on fisheries, and so on. But what drew my attention is like you basically see no differential impact across arms. So my question is like, would you reproduce that? Or would you recommend that kind of intervention to other settings? It wouldn't be more rational to actually provide some sort of additional support that is not necessarily related. Like I think like food and cash are probably very close to each other in a very poor setting. It's probably easier to get inputs or training. So just
Good. Let's have a response. I have a question for Olivier, which I want to pose. So that it's not a question; it's an observation, Olivier. It's good. So it's very interesting. The coefficient of automatic stabilization, a very interesting number. Okay? It's, the highest number is 0.6, roughly speaking, and average is what, about 0.3, something like that. So it's very low. The question is, what leads to differences in this? And one of the things you point to is means tested versus non-means tested benefits. So if benefits are means tested, there's more responsiveness. That's the basic clue, which is very interesting across 50 countries. So the question is, what's the theory behind this? Why is it that means tested benefits are more responsive in terms of shocks? So think about this, Olivier. You have a budget, and at one extreme you divide it equally amongst everybody. You're completely untargeted. At the other extreme, you have very fine targeting. Okay? You go to the poorest, and the next poorest, and the next poorest. The difference between the two is that at the margin, the marginal effect of a completely untargeted thing is, roughly speaking, the mean income of the poor. That's the marginal income measure effect. Okay? Whereas the mean says it's where you end up. Where you end up at the last income, so to speak, is the margin. That's why those two margins differ from each other. And it depends on whether the margin that you hit with the means tested is higher or lower than the margin that you hit with the general, as to whether it's going to be more or less responsive when the overall income distribution goes up and down. What I'm saying is it would be worthwhile thinking about the theory of the finding that you've got from these simulation exercises. Okay, so let's have responses, then we go back to the audience. Let's start in the same sequence of it. Olivier, then.
Not much to add. Thanks for the comment.
Yeah.
So let me just recap what we did first and the results. So in terms of the resilience measure that we had, so we looked at both like a combination of the household's own income and also the poverty line when we are doing our measure of resilience. And we were looking at, so what we found is that from baseline to 4-year post-program, the household's average consumption actually went above $1.90, but it was below above the extreme poverty measure, but below our moderate poverty level, which was $3.20. So in that way, there was no impact on resilience in the medium term, but there were impact in resilience in the more immediate term. And if we are looking at just poverty, there were big impacts on poverty, also 4-year post-program. So if we're looking at just poverty, just the Z, and there were differential impacts between cash and cash plus PCC. Okay, if we are looking at just poverty lines, but if we are combining both the poverty line and some aspects of their current consumption, that's when the kind of the effect goes away, and we do not see any differential impact. So So in terms of, say, for example, like other measures, so there are other papers from this same study that looks at consumption, food security, IPV, and whatnot. We do see all of these impacts, but in terms of our measure, when we take into account also the current consumption of the households, that's when some of these effects get more convoluted, or there are no differential impacts. Okay, and why did this fade away? So there was a question why it faded away 4 years after the program ended. So we found that the control households actually caught up to the treatment households over the period of the 4 years after the treatment ended. So yes, so the average consumption of the control households, so that's where the difference actually closed, and we could not find any impact going forward. And so what are the implications in terms of context and things like that? So in terms of context, it's important because, for example, in the North, where households were more poor, we saw more impact in terms of their average consumption. But in the South, where the households were are slightly better off, even if they were poor households, they were slightly better off. There were no impact going forward. So, so in terms of putting together social protection programs, context would matter, and the size of the transfer would matter when we're designing this kind of program. So if the size of the transfer is not substantial, so if it's a nationwide program and if the size of the transfer is not substantial, then we will see all of these kind of differential effects. So so taking into account the context is important. That's what I would say.
Great. Thanks for the excellent questions. So on the first question, perhaps my presentation was a bit was a bit misleading. So and I wasn't claiming that the social protection system in Mozambique has been in any way overwhelmed by a shift to anticipatory social protection. While there have been some small pilots of anticipatory social protection in Mozambique, it's not widespread. However, there is increasing dialogue and pressure that anticipatory or adaptive social protection, it should move towards a more adaptive or anticipatory system. So I was trying to maybe argue that really Mozambique should be careful not to embrace that these additional responsibilities too quickly before it can even meet the routine. So the analysis was really about the routine social protection system, but that's also not delivering. So that foundational capacity is not quite there. We wouldn't be ready to move on to an adaptive or anticipatory. So apologies if that was unclear. On the second question, Rachel, I believe, I think you're absolutely right. Mozambique probably isn't a unique case. Maybe it's perhaps slightly exceptional in the extent of some of the problems that have emerged, but there's many countries that struggle to just maintain their routine social protection systems. Even in the case of Ethiopia, which has had quite a well-publicized social protection systems, there are many complaints regarding the delays in delivery, et cetera, et cetera. So of course, what can we do? And let's hope that maybe this conference can provide some answers or ideas. I think the financing issue is absolutely fundamental. So the social pension scheme in Mozambique is funded through the government budget, so it's basically not reliant on external funding. But as a result of that, when the government hits financial problems, that financing is either extremely delayed, so they're the last people to be paid. Who gets paid first? The government, the public sector workers get paid first, and only later, if there's money at the end of the month, will they see if there's social protection funding becomes available. So I think finding more sustainable, earmarked sources of revenue will be critical. Of course, that's easier said than done, but I think that's absolutely fundamental. So there is the macro fiscal element that needs to be resolved. I would also say that there's, at least in the Mozambique context, and I don't want to speak for other countries, the landscape of social protection is becoming ever more complex. So this speaks a little bit to the point about anticipatory social protection. So it's not just a social pension. Mozambique has been bringing on child grants. They're bringing on increasing pressure to introduce public work schemes. Of course, these are very relevant in the context of a high poverty country, but it's always the same people who are delivering the same programs. So it's the same meetings that I go to in Mozambique when we talk about social pensions. It's the same group of people from the ministry who operate it that are dealing with public works. It's the same people who are also trying to figure out how to deliver on the child grant. Some of this, unfortunately, we have to be honest, is because the government responds to the needs, not the needs, sorry, the requirements or the demands of funders. The World Bank and other institutions rightly are pushing for an expanded social protection schemes. But then how do you balance that with the fact that often this just becomes piecemeal or weak? So I don't have a solution to that, but decomplexifying the landscape is probably important. You know, focus on one or two schemes and be realistic about what they can deliver, and not try and deliver on 3 or 4 schemes with complementary interventions, no offense, et cetera, because in the context of Mozambique, we just don't have the capacity to deliver that. And thirdly, I think there's a question about legal rights. At least, again, in the context of Mozambique, social protection is often seen as a favor the government imparts and not as a legal entitlement that can be pursued through the judicial system. We heard today that the legal entitlement in India to the right to work has been very important. So perhaps these legal entitlements need to be made clearer, and there needs to be some support to activist groups to actually lobby for those rights to be fulfilled. So these are just some preliminary thoughts, but I hope in the rest of the conference some further ideas will be on the table. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So let's have a second round of observations and questions. There was a, yeah, you had your hand up. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. Although
name and the institution.
Andres Chamba from the World Food Program. Yeah, thank you very much for the presentations to all three. I just wanted to know a little bit more on the Mozambique case. We're calling this anticipatory social protection, but all the disaster management agencies of government were not fully in the picture. Would be also good to know the capacities and computational capacities that they may have in responding to any emergency or even forecasting to a shock or an emergency. From what I recall of my work there, the disaster, the INGC, Instituto Nacional of Risk Management, something like that, have very strong capacities also to deliver emergency responses and perhaps anticipatory action, so that the onus is not purely or mainly in the social protection sector. And how is that a political economy kind of playing out in the country, which I think that's kind of the realm of where this falls. And then just on Saladin, a quick question, because that was a very important message when you mentioned that there's a causal link between poverty and resilience. This is very important that you can unpack a little bit more on what is the relationship between these two issues and what does it really mean, which is a very important point.
Thank you. Other observations, questions? Yes, please. The gentleman there, and then you.
My name is Bajinder. I'm from the UNICEF Global Learning Innovation Hub in Helsinki. My question goes actually beyond the presentations. Based on your experience, what do you think is the future see a fragmentation, or do you think that some lessons learned can help us in the future? And I mean, I know this is kind of a prediction, but the next 2 or 3 years, how do you see the scene unfold? Thank you.
Yeah, please.
Senior Buri from UNU-WIDER. I have also a question, maybe linking to the Bangladesh one, more on what did you think what were your expectations on the effect on resilience measurement? Did you think they would persist after 4 years, and what's the theory behind? And again, maybe looking at the rationale why it was fading away. Were there other shocks happening, or why do you think that the control group caught up?
Okay, other questions? Also, yes, please.
Sorry, I think I'll start.
Yes, please.
Shimba from the Zambia Institute for Policy Analysis and Research. I just want to find out from Bangladesh and Mozambique, what has been your experience with graduation pathways? I know we're speaking about this in the context of resources being inadequate. I think for Zambia, partly global shifts around IDA are also becoming extremely tight. So on one end, you're thinking of social protection, but how do you support education when you've had funding cuts? But what has been your experience around graduation pathways? Perhaps for governments, that's what becomes important in terms of looking at social protection as an investment as opposed to something that will just flow.
Okay, last chance to put a question or observation, but then we'll go to the panel for fun. Yes, please, ma'am.
I'm Prudence Babido from the University of Witwatersrand. I have a question for Olivier. You saw a lot of contrasted situations across regions, and there's a point where the effect disappeared among African countries. Is it because the system has still really developed, or what is it reflecting in terms of the comparative analysis?
Okay, I have two observations, very quick observations. One is comparing Sam and Olivier, the coefficient stabilization. One of the reasons why the coefficient stabilization might be low is because there's no money. So we have these design issues. You can have the best design, but if there's no money, the coefficient will be very low. So there's that aspect of it. And the second, Sam, your observation, which really strikes home to those of us who try to do these things on the ground, is that when different donors come with their favorite scheme for whatever, and that's loaded on, that we see on the ground all the time as leading to overstretching the capacity. And I'm quite pessimistic about those things because there are these pressures that come from internally from these donors, from the World Bank side, from bilaterals, this is the favor of the month, and so on and so forth. Having tried to work against that, it seems to be a very difficult thing to do. Anyway, over to you to respond. Let's do it in reverse order. Then Sam, Joseph, and then
Great.
Then we'll go into a close.
Thanks so much again for the excellent questions and comments. Quickly on the disaster management, I think you're quite right, Andres, that when we're entering shock responsive or anticipatory social protection, we're also often including new government agencies or additional government agencies. Some of them may be more or less capable, I agree, than others. In the context of Mozambique, I think the National Institute for what's called disaster management now has some capability in responding to shocks, but the anticipatory component has been until recently very, very weak. I think one of the issues, though, is that even if they were to take on some responsibility, even for anticipatory, the registration issue remains a challenge, and we do not have what might be called a unified social registry or any, let's say, maintenance or updating of these registries over time. So I think that is a challenge, particularly in the Mozambican context, is to have some form of reasonably robust unified social registry that could be drawn upon by different agencies. But again, talking about layering responsibilities, right? This is another thing that's actually now the flavor of the month in Mozambique is how do we create a universal registry? But these cost millions of dollars, to implement, and not just implement once, they obviously need to be maintained. So again, these are big questions. Very quickly on the future, I think it's really this basic income. Is that going to be, is that something that could be a unifying concept. I think we need to think about that for lots of reasons, not about necessarily kind of implementation or fiscal space, but about ethics and also about protecting certain programs in law. And that seems to be a stronger pathway perhaps than others. But I think it's going to be a very challenging to think about a basic income. Even in Mozambique, it would require 10 to 15% of GDP, and that's just in transfers alone. So, adding on administrative costs, they are potentially very expensive. And finally, graduation pathways. Mozambique has a limited experience. They have one scheme that theoretically involves a graduation pathway, but as yet the government has not been able to implement any of these complementary activities because it's basically public works plus graduation. The public works component has been quite difficult to implement, and the graduation therefore hasn't really been received any attention. I think this is another example of things that look good on paper, but in practice are really difficult to implement at any level of quality that's going to be meaningful. Thanks.
Okay, let me try to tackle some of these very difficult questions. On the causal link, so what I said was we found in this study a strong causal link between the poverty alleviation interventions that we tested here and between poverty and resilience to poverty. So, and that's what we found, that the cash and the plus BCC programs have a strong effect on poverty and also the resilience to poverty within the framework of this particular RCT in the north and south of Bangladesh. And in terms of the effect and why it did not persist 4-year post-program for some of these arms, so we found that during the course of the RCT, the impact was stronger in the north than the south, right? And the north so the kind of BCC that were imparted were basically growing vegetables and fruits and raising chickens, livestock, IYCF practices and things like that. And because of, for example, the favorable agroecological qualities in the north compared to the south, which is more flood prone, the north could take advantage of that. And that's why we see that the effect kind of persisted. But in the south, because of all the natural disasters and also the control group kind of catching up, we could not really see that effect persisting in the medium term. Yeah, so that's and the future of social protection, I'll leave it up to
Olivia, you are between the audience and lunch. So.
Good, okay. I'll be quick. To answer Prudence, it would be good to zoom on specific region, in particular on Africa. But I think the conclusion would be preserved from what I saw, especially the fact that informality, if you formalize the labor force, that would not be all. As Ravi said, there's probably a lack of money in the first place, and also the nature of the transfer systems that is important. That there's a lot of heterogeneity, as you know well. I mean, South Africa is quite different. We had passed a paper on comparing South Africa and the other countries in the region. On the general question about the future of social assistance, it's a good question. I don't know very well the political economy literature, but it's certainly crucial what people would do about it and the pressure they could put on their leader, or to compare autocratic and the few democratic countries left in this world and see how they vary also in the ability to diffuse or to implement social assistance. It's not so clear. And the role of international organization, I was on a little bit working on a program with colleagues from the IMF and the World Bank for Gabon, and I was a bit surprised by the lack of pressure that they can put on countries that country, I mean, the IMF could negotiate a bit how they would renew the loan for Gabon. And at the time, in the middle of the different element and the stakes was the complete renovation or a change of their social assistance system, and there was very little influence put by or pressure put by the IMF, and I was very surprised. I think it could have been more. So that's probably one of the pessimistic element, I would say, that I have witnessed, but I don't have a big picture.
Let's thank our speakers for really very good sessions.